Okay, so we left off with finishing up the Calvin cycle. And so remember, the purpose of the Calvin cycle is to make your sugar molecule. So you get one G3P, and then that happens, two of these makes one glucose molecule, and therefore you get a 6-carbon compound. So remember that this happens, this picture here is giving you the kind of the totals of 3 CO2s coming in, but each one of them enter one at a time, and the end product is this G3P. So therefore, this what we're seeing here, the cycle occurs 6 times to make your glucose because you need 6 CO2s. But the way it's written here, you have 3 CO2s coming in, and so everything is tripled to get your G3P at the end. So my next question to you is, let's put down here, I want you to total up. Let's see, what's the total needed to make one glucose? And I want you to figure out how many ATPs you would need in the Calvin cycle and how many NADPHs. So you need to pause this right now and see if you can actually calculate that, looking at the picture. Okay, so you should have tried this, and so let's look at this. To make one G3P molecule, how many ATPs are needed? So here's 6 ATPs, and here's 3 ATPs. And so that's a total of 9 ATPs to make one G3P. How many of those needed to make glucose? You double it, 2 of those. So therefore, instead of 9, we have 18 ATP needed. And then the NADPH, well, let's look at the NADPH. Here, you have 6 NADPHs going in, right? And that's the only place the NADPHs come. And so therefore you multiply by that by 2 because it's 2 G3Ps, and so then you should have a total of 12 NADPHs. Okay? So this is your totals. Now my next question is about how they're made. Remember, ATP and NADPH come from what process? The light reactions. So if we go back a page and look at our light reactions here, NADPH and ATP are made in equal quantities. So therefore, as the NADPH is 1-to-1 ratio here, and ATP go to the Calvin cycle, here's our Calvin cycle, they're not used in equal quantities. So, we have a problem. Which one are we going to run out of first, ATP or NADPH? You should have said, what? ATP, because you use more ATP. So if they're made in a 1-to-1 ratio, you're going to run out of ATP before you run out of NADPH, and therefore the whole cycle can't happen without those ATP. So realistically, we need to, in the light reactions, we need to make more ATP than we do NADPH. So how in the world does that happen? That happens in what we call cyclic electron flow. So that's the part we skipped yesterday. So if we go back here to this page, right here. So go back to this underneath the little analogy that actually we're going to do tomorrow. And here's your cyclic electron flow. So what I want us to understand here, what we had already talked about is non-cyclic electron flow, which is, just to quickly review, remember that the light comes in, absorbed by the accessory pigments, gets to chlorophyll A in the reaction center, electrons get excited. These electrons right here are replaced by water. These electrons go down the electron transport chain to this chlorophyll. These electrons go to make NADPH. So the electron transport chain, remember, makes ATP by using ATP synthase. And so this is a 1-to-1 ratio, but it's called non-cyclic because the flow of electrons is more linear. All right, I mean, they get excited and stuff, but it's more linear. What we're going to talk about next is how we get to make more ATP than we do NADPH. So what is the part of the light reactions that is used to make ATP? The electron transport chain, because if you recall, the electron transport chain pumps in, let me use this picture here. As the electrons go through the electron transport chain, it pumps in H pluses, which then are used to make ATP. So therefore, if you do the electron transport chain more ATP will be, H pluses will be pumped in and more ATP will be made. So that's what cyclic electron flow is all about, is changing the flow of electrons. And so instead of electrons going to NADPH, what they're going to do is, once they get excited here, this plant drops them back in the electron transport chain, and they keep cycling, hence cyclic, electron flow through the electron transport chain, cycling around and around and around, not making any NADPH, but instead, as they cycle round and round and round, they pump H pluses in that are used to make ATP when they flow through ATP synthase. So that's what this picture here is about. So cyclic electron flow uses only photosystem 1 and produces only ATP. Cyclic electron flow generates the surplus ATP, satisfying the higher demand in the Calvin cycle. This is the 18, remember, ATP needed versus only 12 NADPH is needed. And so that's satisfying that higher demand. So what I want to point out here, let me illustrate. It's this part right here. This part right here is the part that happens over and over again. So I'll highlight that. This part, it's kind of hard to see. This part, and actually I should put it like this because I don't know if you can tell that these guys are supposed to be a little bit lighter in color, and these are lighter in color, and this part is darker. That's the part that is involved in cyclic electron flow. These parts don't happen. So what happens here is when these electrons in photosystem 1 get excited and go to the primary electron acceptor, instead of going to ferredoxin and eventually to NADPH, they're dropped back into the electron transport chain. So ferredoxin, instead of transferring it to NADPH, transfers it back into the electron transport chain, and so then they go through the electron transport chain, end up replacing this chlorophyll A electrons. They get excited with the next photon of light, and they get dropped back in the electron transport chain, and so on and so forth. So what happens is you pump more and more H pluses, which makes more and more ATP, and so therefore they do this and making more ATP until and not making any NADPH until they equal again the NADPHs. So let's think about this. If my left hand is ATP and my right hand is NADPH, they're made in equal quantities. So the distance up from the bottom of your screen is the quantity. So they're made in equal quantities. We got a lot of them. They travel to the Calvin cycle. So here's ATP, NADPH. They're starting to be used, but ATP is used at a faster rate, and so therefore we're going to run out of that. So then what the chloroplast does is then switches to cyclic electron flow, which only, instead of making NADPH, only makes ATP. So therefore now that ATP number is going to go back up, and once it reaches again with the equal in terms of the NADPH and ATP, then it goes back to non-cyclic. So then instead of coming over here and going through the cycle, then it'll start to go to NADPH and do non-cyclic again and make them in a 1-to-1 ratio, ATP and NADPH in a 1-to-1 ratio, and then they go to the Calvin cycle, it starts using ATP more, then it'll flip back to the cyclic electron flow, and so on and so forth. So it keeps on oscillating back and forth from cyclic to non-cyclic electron flow to kind of catch up and make more ATP than NADPH because they're used on equal amounts. So I'm going to go ahead and write a couple of things about this down here so that explains this picture. So the first one is the chloroplast uses more ATP than NADPH, which are produced in equal amounts. Second, if ATP runs low, because it's used more in the Calvin cycle, NADPH accumulates. So I have enough room, I'm going to put 3 over here. 3, this stimulates cyclic electron flow, which makes what instead of what? Makes ATP, but not what? NADPH. This allows the chloroplast ATP numbers to quote unquote catch up with NADPH. And so, like I said, oscillates back and forth between using both of those. And so that is photosynthesis in a nutshell. So the very back page, the very last page of your notes, just gives you an overview, again, of the whole process of photosynthesis. And so this is similar, this picture down here, similar to what we did at the beginning. It gives you a little bit more information. It says the energy entering chloroplast as sunlight gets stored as chemical energy in organic compounds. Sugar made in the chloroplast supplies chemical energy in carbon skeletons to synthesize the organic molecules of cells. In addition to food production, photosynthesis also produces the oxygen in our atmosphere, which then sustains every other living organism. And so again, we have, it just goes through a little bit more in detail instead of just saying the light reactions here. Talks about photosystem 2, the electron transport chain, and photosystem 1, collectively part of the light reactions and how they make the NADPH and ATP. And this is your Calvin cycle and the CO2, and you get sugars. So this is showing you sucrose as an example. That's another type of sugar. Glucose is a type of sugar. And then some of that glucose can be used for energy. Some of that can be used for storage. So notice here that starch is a chain of glucose. So remember that plants use some of the glucose it makes, and it stores some of it. And the good thing it does, so that other organisms like ourselves can eat the plant and get glucose, because plants are the thing on earth that actually makes the glucose. Also, some of that G3P can actually be used to make some amino acids and fatty acids that are used. Amino acids are used to make what? I should say proteins. Fatty acids are used to make fats. All right, sucrose. We have starch. We can also put glucose here. All right, and so on. And so that is photosynthesis.